Welcome. Today we are launching the Frederick Douglass Trail in Belfast. I'm Christine Kinealy. I'm a historian at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut. And just to start off, this project is part of a larger project that looks at other Black abolitionists who visited Ireland between 1790 and 1860. Of course, Frederick Douglass is the most famous one. If you don't know much about Frederick Douglass, just very briefly, he was born in 1818 into enslavement. He escaped when he was 20 years old. He changed his name then to Frederick Douglass. He became a lecturer for the Anti-Slavery Society, and in 1845 he published his life story. His life story became very famous, but it meant he was in danger of being recaptured and re-enslaved. So he decided to travel to the United Kingdom. He sailed to Liverpool in August 1845, spent 2 days in Liverpool, and then travelled to Ireland. He intended to stay 4 days in Ireland, but he was made so welcome, he stayed for 4 months. And during that time, he visited Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Youghal, Cork, Limerick, and finally, Belfast. When he arrived in Dublin, he wrote that night to his mentor, William Lloyd Garrison, to say he was safe in old Dublin. And he spent a month in Dublin, and so we have created a walking trail in Dublin, which you can see before you. So Belfast is our second walking trail. So Frederick came to Belfast at the end of his 4-month visit, and he was in Belfast December and early January 1846. In Belfast, he was hosted by the Belfast Anti-Slavery Society, an organisation founded in the 1830s that was mostly Protestant. So it was very different from the people who had been his hosts in the rest of Ireland. The Belfast Society was quite moderate, and they opposed the radicalism of William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick's mentor. And these are the places the trail takes you to in Belfast. And we have chosen 13 different places that recreate some of the sights, sounds, smells, and buildings that Frederick would have seen during his stay in the town. And this is very much a drop-in, drop-out. You can start at any point. You can do a few places and do it the next day. So it's very, very flexible. And just to say, Belfast in the 1840s, it was not a city at that point, it was a town. It was predominantly Presbyterian. Linen was very much at the core of the economy, but shipbuilding was also becoming very important. And the population of Belfast was increasing rapidly, 10,000 people in 1810, over 75,000 people in 1841, around the time that Frederick visited. And we know 1845 also starts the onset of the Great Hunger in Ireland. And just to say, Belfast was affected because most of the poor people in Belfast subsisted on potatoes. So Belfast was affected by the famine. So to the trail, the starting point of the trail is the Clifton Street Cemetery, a beautiful, beautiful Georgian building, very much associated with the Belfast Charitable Society. It's also associated with one of the heroes of abolition in Belfast, Mary Ann McCracken. And Mary Ann was a humanitarian, a nationalist, a socialist, and she was also a founder of Belfast Female Anti-Slavery Society. She was buried in this cemetery, sadly in an unmarked grave. It took 40 years before she had a headstone, and at that point she was joined by her beloved brother, Henry Joy, who had been hanged in 1798 for his part in the Rising. And part of the hidden history of this cemetery is recently we've discovered that an escaped slave, William John Brown from Maryland, as was Frederick Douglass, is also buried here. Sadly, in an unmarked plot, we don't know where he's buried. We do know that his wife and children were still enslaved. Our second stop on the trail is Clifton House, which is very close to the cemetery. And again, it's associated with the Belfast Charitable Society, an organisation founded in the 18th century to help the poor and vulnerable of the town. And the beautiful Georgian building still exists, again, very much associated with the McCracken family, including Mary Ann McCracken. Our third stop is somewhere you may not have heard of, Lancastrian School. This school system existed throughout the United Kingdom, and it was mostly for poor children. And Frederick held one of his final meetings in Ireland at the Lancastrian School. He spoke to the children about the evils of alcohol. And the school was actually located in the local meeting house for the Quakers, and part of that meeting house still survived. So you can visit there and see where Frederick spoke on the evils of alcohol. And true to his beliefs, when Frederick was in Belfast, he stayed in a Temperance Hotel. And the Victoria Temperance Hotel, corner of York and Donegal Street. Many Temperance hotels, which might seem odd, served fine wines. They believed only spirits were evil. But his hotel served nothing. And unfortunately, this hotel did not survive. By 1850, it had closed down. And in 1941, it was bombed during the Blitz. So there are no remains of the hotel where Frederick stayed, but that is where he stayed. The Cathedral Quarter is now a very famous part of the Heritage Trail in Belfast, and part of it, Donegal Street, was host to many, many churches, both then and both now. And one of the first places that Frederick spoke at was what was called the Independent Church on Donegal Street. It then became part of the Congregation Church, and it then, unfortunately, was knocked down. And again, it was bombed during the Blitz, but it was rebuilt, and part of it still remains to this day. And it is now known as Redeemer Central, a non-sectarian, non-religious meeting place. Frederick spoke in another church in Donegal Street. Unfortunately, now it's totally gone, but very famous because it was associated with a man called Isaac Nelson, a Presbyterian minister who was known to be a bit of a maverick. In his later life, he became a nationalist and stood as nationalist MP for County Mayo. Of course, the Presbyterian Church in Belfast was shocked, and they allowed the church to go into disuse, and it was eventually demolished. But Isaac Nelson is remembered because a church in the Shankill Road was dedicated to him. That church does survive, although it is no longer functioning as a place of worship. And that is the church, if you want to also visit that. A slightly unusual place to visit, number 6, is the Calder Fountain. And this man, Francis Calder, formerly of the Royal Navy, was one of Frederick's hosts while Frederick was in Belfast. And Calder was known for his love of animals. And he was very concerned that cattle and horses did not get enough fresh water while they were walking through the streets. So he erected a number of water troughs. And in memory of what he did for animals, this beautiful Calder Memorial was erected as a tribute to Francis Calder. So again, a place you can visit, and it's in the elegant Custom House Square, adjoining the waterfront. So when Frederick spoke in Belfast, one of the places he visited was the beautiful commercial buildings and assembly room. And when Frederick left Belfast, a beautiful breakfast was held in his honour. And at the breakfast, the Reverend Nelson gave him a pocket Bible. At that breakfast, it was also announced that Mary Ann McCracken and some other women in Belfast would form a Belfast anti-slavery society. This beautiful building was also home to a bank, to a newspaper, as well as all these social functions. More recently, part of it has been transformed into a bar called the Northern Whig. So again, a place you might visit and maybe even take a few refreshments. And that is Frederick Douglass, aged 27, the age he was when he was in Belfast. Our next stop, number 8, is Rosemary Street. Again, very famous to anybody who knows Belfast. And this is an image of Rosemary Street in about 1840, even recognisable to this day. And Rosemary Street was home to this beautiful church, which still survives, but it was home to 2 other Presbyterian churches. Unfortunately, they have not survived. But the Rosemary Street Presbyterian Church has the honour of being the oldest place of worship in Belfast. Rosemary Street has been associated with periods of radicalism, including the founding of the United Irishmen in the 1790s, again, very much with the McCracken family. It's also been host to a number of other Black abolitionists, including, who you see before you, Odola Equiano, who came to Belfast in 1791 and was hosted by the United Irishmen. Charles Reman spoke in this church in 1841, and Henry Highland Garland spoke in this church in 1851. So it has a very long, honourable tradition of being associated with abolition and with other radical causes. A church that Frederick spoke at that sadly no longer survives was on Donegal Place. If you know Belfast, you'll know it's sort of down from what is now the City Hall, down from what was Marks and Spencer's, we hope it will survive, and a bit up from Royal Avenue. This church was built in the 1840s, it was demolished in the 1880s, Frederick spoke there, but changes in Methodism meant it was no longer needed, and so it was closed down and had a short life. The next stop is the Black Man. And you will notice the Black Man is not black. He's an oxidized murky green. And it's a tribute to the Reverend Henry Cook. And Henry Cook was a Presbyterian minister, but unlike some of the other Presbyterian ministers we've talked about, he was incredibly conservative. He was anti-Catholic, anti-nationalist. He hated Daniel O'Connell, leader of the repeal movement. But for conservative Protestants, he was a hero, and they felt he should be memorialized. And so in 1876, this statue was put up in honor of him. What we do know is, although Cook supported abolition, he did not meet Frederick Douglass. And this is probably because Frederick Douglass was very critical of Presbyterian churches who worked with slaveholders in America. And if you look at the statue, you'll notice that Cook's back is turned on this beautiful school just across from it, the Royal Academical Institution, which was known for its liberal values, which Cook hated. And this beautiful school was host to many anti-slavery meetings in the 1840s and later. A building that does exist, where Frederick also spoke at, is the Methodist Church on Donegal Square East. The facade remains, but it was recently taken over by the Ulster Bank. And when Frederick was in Belfast in the 1840s, City Hall was not there. As I said, Belfast was not a city, but in that beautiful square was this very elegant, gorgeous building, the White Linen Hall. Again, the centre of the linen industry in the north of Ireland. When Belfast became a city in 1888, it was decided to demolish this building and to put a City Hall in its place. The City Hall was opened in 1906. And recently it's been decided to erect a statue to Mary Ann McCracken in the site of City Hall. So very, very appropriate. The music hall, again, no longer exists, but it was opened in the 1840s by the town's Anacreontic Society. A hard word to say, and if you don't know what they were devoted to the Greek god of that name, who loved wine and music. And Belfast in the 1840s was noted for the excellence of its entertainment, including its music. Frederick spoke in the music hall in October 1846. He was joined by his mentor from America, William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison took the lead, and he was very antagonistic, very critical of Belfast people and of the churches, and ended up being booed. So it was not a happy ending. Unfortunately, the music hall no longer survives. It was demolished in 1983, despite being seen as a place of architectural significance. But we do still have a small memorial in the form of the Music Hall Lane sign, which does survive. And our final place on this trail is the home of Mary Ann McCracken on the Donegal Pass. So we start and we end with this incredible woman. And as Belfast spread and industrialised after 1850, so too did the town spread out. And so these houses were part of that spreading out of the town. Mary Ann McCracken lived here in her 80s and 90s, and this incredible woman, even at that age, was still a political activist and would go down to Belfast docks and urge emigrants not to get tied up with slavery when they went to America, but to support abolition. So an incredible, incredible woman who was an activist to the very end of her life. And this place is significant because it's one of the few places that actually acknowledges Belfast's female past and Belfast's abolitionist past. And there is a small blue plaque to Mary Ann McCracken. And she is simply described as a social reformer. And that is the young Mary Ann. And just one final place that is not on the trail, but definitely worth a visit. It's on the Peace Wall near the Falls Road. It's a beautiful mural to Frederick Douglass. There was one, just a Frederick, it was painted over. This one incorporates many human rights activists. You can see Daniel O'Connell, Mary Ann McCracken, Mandela, President Obama, and since 2014, Congressman John Lewis has been included. So it's a real tribute of the people of Belfast to human rights activists. And just finally, Frederick left Belfast in January 1846. He travelled to Scotland. In Scotland, he felt increasingly homesick. A few months later, some women abolitionists purchased his freedom. And finally, in April 1847, Frederick was able to return to America to his wife and his young 4 children. He never returned to Belfast again.